Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight, we dive into one of the most chilling and mysterious stories from 1861 Alabama, the tale of a slave infant whose cry defied logic, science, and reason, summoning death in ways no one could explain. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every story here is deeply researched from true historical accounts, hours of investigation so you get the real whispers of the past. 1861, Alabama was a place steeped in tension, fear, and unrelenting control. The air was thick with the weight of slavery, as plantations stretched across the fields, and the economy depended entirely on the labor of enslaved people. This was a society where fear ruled, not just among those enslaved, but also among the slaveholders themselves. Rumors of rebellion, mysterious illnesses, and unexplained events spread quickly, and superstition ran rampant. Every plantation operated under strict rules, enforced with brutality, yet no amount of discipline could suppress the uncertainty that hovered over daily life. Families of enslaved people lived under constant threat, not only from physical punishment, but also from the unknown. The owners believed in the power of science, medicine, and reason, yet even they had to confront things they could not explain. It was in this environment of control and fear that the story of the enigmatic infant began. The cries of a newborn, in a society already paranoid and haunted by superstition, were never just noise. They were interpreted as omens, signals of danger, or signs of forces beyond human comprehension. People whispered about curses, spirits, and unnatural power. The infant's first cries did not merely pierce the night, they shattered the fragile sense of order that plantation life depended upon, and in that very setting, the impossible began to unfold. In essence, Alabama in 1861 was a powder keg of fear, superstition, and power imbalance. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every sound could be a warning. The birth of this infant, already different, already mysterious, was enough to ignite panic and fascination alike, setting the stage for events that defied logic and science. The birth of the infant was unlike anything anyone on the plantation had ever witnessed. It was a hot, humid night in Alabama, and the air inside the small slave quarters was thick with tension and exhaustion. Women gathered around, assisting the mother with care born from experience, yet even their seasoned hands sensed that something was different about this child. From the very first moments, the infant exhibited peculiar behaviors that defied all expectation. Unlike other newborns who might cry softly, this baby's wail was piercing, sharper, almost unnatural, and strikingly powerful for a child so tiny. Those who heard it described a sound that seemed to linger, vibrating through the wooden walls of the cabin, leaving a chill in its wake. Some said the cry sounded older than the child, almost as if it carried knowledge or warning that no infant could possibly possess. But it wasn't just the cry. Witnesses spoke of the child's eyes, wide, intense, and unsettlingly aware, seeming to fixate on corners of the room where nothing stood. The infant's skin reportedly had an odd pallor, and its movements were unusually deliberate, with small hands that grasped and clenched with a strength that frightened even the mother. These were not merely quirks of a newborn, they were anomalies that unsettled everyone present. The reaction among the enslaved people was immediate. Whispers filled the room. Some believed the child carried the spirit, a curse, or a warning. Others feared that its presence might bring death or misfortune. Even the plantation owners, who prided themselves on rationality and authority, could not ignore the intensity of the infant's cries, which seemed to echo through the property as if the land itself mourned or trembled. From the very first night, It was clear this infant was no ordinary child. Every sound, movement, and glance seemed to challenge reason, forcing those who witnessed it to confront the terrifying possibility that some forces could not be explained by science or human understanding. This marked the beginning of a tale that would haunt the plantation for months to come and leave a legacy of fear that even time could not erase. As word of the infant's strange cries and unsettling presence spread, the atmosphere on the plantation, and soon across neighboring ones, became charged with fear and superstition. Among the enslaved people, the reactions were immediate and visceral. Those who had endured years of hardship knew the fine line between the natural and the supernatural. They had seen illness strike suddenly, accidents happen without explanation, and mysterious deaths claimed lives in ways that defied logic. But this child was different. The cries carried a weight, a presence that seemed to pierce the soul. Some whispered that the infant was a harbinger of death, a spirit sent to warn of calamity. Mothers clutched their own children tightly, fearing that the newborn's wail could bring harm or misfortune. Old women, keepers of oral histories and folklore, gathered in hushed circles recounting tales of children born under omens, whose arrival signaled upheaval or sorrow. Candles were lit at odd hours, prayers murmured into the night, and charms or small protective rituals were whispered about, as if some act of faith could shield the household from whatever power this infant possessed. But the reactions of the plantation owners were starkly different, though equally intense. Men who considered themselves rational and educated found themselves unsettled by the child's presence. Some attempted to explain the phenomena scientifically. Perhaps the infant was ill, or perhaps the mother had birthed a child with unusual strength. But even the physicians brought in from nearby towns were stumped. Reports described doctors frowning, scribbling notes, and leaving in silence, their confidence shaken. Rumors began to circulate beyond the quarters, reaching neighboring plantations. People speculated wildly, could this infant be a witch's child, or perhaps a spirit in human form? The fear spread like wildfire. The mere presence of the child caused unease. Workers whispered about accidents that happened after the infant's cries, livestock that refused to eat, or sudden illnesses that struck without warning. In essence, both enslaved people and owners, despite their vastly different perspectives, were united in an unsettling realization: this was no ordinary infant. The cries and behaviors challenged their understanding of life, nature, and the very forces that governed their world. The infant had, from the moment of birth, become a living enigma, an object of fear, superstition, and morbid fascination, and in that tension, the stage was set for events that would defy science and claim lives in ways no one could predict. The first recorded instance of the infant's deathly cry came just days after its birth, late one night, when the plantation was quiet, save for the creaking of the wooden floors and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The mother had laid the baby down in a small cradle beside her, hoping for a peaceful night, but around midnight, a sound shattered the darkness, sharp, high-pitched, and chilling to the bone. Those who were near the cabin reported that the cry was unlike any human wail they had ever heard. It wasn't just loud, it carried a resonance, a strange vibration that seemed to move through walls, floors, and even the air itself. Animals on the plantation reacted first. Dogs whimpered and hid, horses kicked in their stalls, and birds fell silent, their songs abruptly cut off. Within moments, the humans inside the cabin felt it too, a sensation of dread that pressed on the chest like a weight. What made this cry truly terrifying was what followed. Almost immediately after the sound, Something inexplicable occurred. One of the older slaves, a man in robust health, suddenly collapsed in convulsions and died before anyone could reach him. Others nearby reported feelings of dizziness, nausea, and a cold, creeping fear that left them shaking. Those who could speak swore the infant's gaze seemed fixed upon the dying man, as if the child's very eyes had summoned his end. Word spread quickly across the plantation. Some called it a curse, others a spiritual warning, and a few of the more rational plantation owners tried desperately to deny the event. They brought in physicians and midwives to examine both the infant and the scene, hoping to find a natural explanation, but all left puzzled and unnerved. The cries persisted sporadically over the next few nights, and each time, misfortune seemed to follow: sick animals, injuries, or sudden deaths that could not be explained. The atmosphere on the plantation changed dramatically. Fear replaced normalcy, and even the most skeptical observers began to treat the infant with a mix of awe and terror. Every cry was no longer a sound. It was a portent, a living signal that death or disaster might be near. This first recorded incident cemented the infant's reputation as something beyond comprehension, a being whose presence could not be rationalized, whose cries defied science, and whose very existence haunted all who encountered it. As the infant's strange cries and their deadly consequences became more widely known, the plantation owners grew desperate for answers. They prided themselves on order, reason, and the power of science, and yet nothing they tried could explain what was happening. Doctors were called from nearby towns, men who were trained in the medicine of the time, armed with knowledge of anatomy, disease, and the human body. Scholars, too, were summoned, some with backgrounds in early psychology and natural philosophy, hoping to shed light on this perplexing situation. From the very first examinations, the experts were unsettled. The infant appeared physically normal, no signs of illness, deformity, or genetic anomaly that could account for its extraordinary cries or the apparent influence those cries seemed to have over others. Vital signs were strong, reflexes normal, yet the intensity of the child's wail remained unexplainable. One doctor wrote in his notes that the infant emits sounds that shake the air with a force no ordinary lungs could produce, and confessed that even his extensive training could not account for what he had witnessed. Scholars attempted to observe patterns. Was it coincidence, disease, or an unknown contagion? They tried isolating the infant, testing its interactions with people, and even recording the timing of the cries. Yet no matter what they did, the events persisted. Each cry seemed to precede misfortune or death, defying every principle of natural science they knew. Some suggested hysteria or mass panic among the enslaved people caused the deaths, but even isolated individuals reported dizziness, sudden illness, and a creeping sense of dread when near the infant. The more they investigated, the more baffling it became. Equipment and early instruments of measurement, thermometers, rudimentary stethoscopes, and sound resonance experiments showed nothing extraordinary, yet the subjective experiences of the witnesses could not be ignored. Fear, unease, and tragedy continued to follow the child. Ultimately, the scientific community of the time reached a rare consensus. This was a case that could not be explained. Some privately admitted that it might be beyond the scope of medicine or reason, while others quietly left, shaken, unwilling to return. The infant had, in essence, exposed the limits of human understanding. Science, which so many relied on for certainty and control, had failed to provide answers. And in that failure, the legend of the infant grew even darker, proof, in the eyes of many, that forces existed in the world that no human logic could contain, As the infant's cries continued, the plantation quickly became a place of dread and whispered fear. Every time the baby cried, piercing, unnatural, and almost deliberate, tragedy seemed to follow. What began as small misfortunes soon escalated into death, cementing the infant's reputation as a harbinger of doom. The earliest recorded incident involved a young field worker, barely in his teens, who had been tending livestock late one evening. Witnesses reported that just as the infant's wail echoed from the cabin, the boy stumbled and fell near a corral, a kick from a startled horse breaking his leg and sending him into convulsions. He would not survive the night. Others began noticing patterns that defied explanation. Animals became restless or violent whenever the child cried. Livestock would refuse to eat or drop dead, and even the soil seemed to act, with crops wilting inexplicably in patches, near where the sound seemed to carry most strongly. The enslaved people were particularly affected. Several elders spoke of feeling a sudden cold wash over them when the infant cried, accompanied by dizziness, nausea, and overwhelming dread. Some reported dreams of death, nightmares that seemed to mirror events that later occurred in reality. There were even accounts of people who survived accidents or illness only to fall gravely ill shortly afterward, always coinciding with the baby's cries. Even the plantation owners, men and women who had believed themselves in control of their property and lives, could not escape. Horses and carriages crashed unexpectedly, workers fell ill, and minor injuries turned fatal in inexplicable ways. Those in the household began to fear nighttime as much as the enslaved did, moving cautiously, often pausing near the cabin, as if the infant's presence itself demanded respect. The mysterious deaths and misfortunes turned the plantation into a place of tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Conversations slowed, eyes darted nervously at the cabin, and even those who did not believe in curses began to take precautions, doors left open. The infant moved to different parts of the house, and prayers or rituals were performed in hope of protection. But the pattern was relentless. The infant's cries, it seemed, were not just sounds, they were catalysts, summoning calamity in ways that no one could anticipate or control. It was in this relentless chain of misfortune that the legend began to grow. The infant was no longer just a mysterious child. It was a symbol of the unknown, a living enigma whose presence challenged life, death, and reason itself. And as the days and nights passed, the plantation became a silent witness to events that would be recounted for generations as both horror and wonder. Among the enslaved community, the infant's cries did not just signal fear, they carried meaning, a language of the unseen that they had learned to interpret over generations. For them, life was not merely about survival under the whip or the watchful eyes of plantation owners. It was also a constant negotiation with forces that could not be explained by science alone. Spirits, omens, and ancestral powers were real, and every unusual event was carefully observed and interpreted. From the first night the infant cried, whispers spread. Some believed the child was a harbinger, sent by spirits to warn of death or impending disaster. Elders spoke in low tones of children born under shadows, those rare souls who carried the weight of messages from the other side. In this belief system, the infant's cries were more than just sound. They were communication, warnings etched in air, and vibration, too subtle and strange for outsiders to understand. Others feared curses. Some speculated that the infant was the vessel of a curse placed long ago, perhaps by an ancestor or a wronged spirit, meant to punish the living. These fears were compounded by the strange coincidences, sudden illnesses, livestock deaths, or inexplicable accidents that seemed to follow each wail. In the eyes of the enslaved, the infant's existence was not random, it was deliberate, a manifestation of forces seeking balance or retribution. Rituals and protective measures began to take shape. Small charms, herbs, and whispered prayers were placed near the baby or on the windowsills of the cabin. Certain elders would mutter incantations at night, asking the spirits to spare the living while acknowledging the power the infant carried. Children were warned not to stare too long, and no one approached the crib without a sense of reverence, almost fear. Even acts as simple as walking softly or speaking quietly became rituals of survival, meant to avoid drawing the infant's attention or anger. But these measures were not only about fear, they were about understanding. The enslaved community recognized patterns in the cries and the consequences that followed. The infant, in their eyes, was not evil, but a messenger of the unseen, a bridge between the living and forces they could not control. The adults understood that the cries carried warnings and lessons, though the meaning was often obscure, leaving them in a delicate balance of respect, awe, and terror. In essence, the theories among the enslaved people gave shape to the inexplicable. Where science failed, their spiritual interpretations provided context, if not comfort. They saw the infant as both a warning and a guardian, a child whose very presence forced them to confront life, death, and the forces that lurked just beyond human understanding. And in this recognition, a complex relationship formed: fear mingled with reverence, and every cry became a moment to pause, reflect, and acknowledge a world larger and stranger than they had ever imagined. The plantation owners, terrified by the infant's cries and the growing trail of misfortune, soon felt compelled to act. They were men and women who prided themselves on control over their land, their property, and tragically, over the enslaved people who lived and worked there. Yet, the infant defied their authority in a way nothing else had. No punishment, no discipline, and no reasoning could quiet the child's cries or prevent the events that seemed to follow. Their first attempts were practical and rooted in the limited medical understanding of the time. Physicians were called back repeatedly to examine the infant, seeking illness, deformity, or abnormality that might account for the terrifying wails. Some plantation owners even considered sending the baby to another household, hoping that distance would sever the strange chain of events. Yet the cries persisted, as though the infant carried an invisible force within, unbound by walls or boundaries. Frustration soon gave way to more extreme measures. Some owners tried to silence the baby by separating it from the mother, keeping it in isolation for long periods, and even employing harsh methods to quiet the child. Every attempt failed. The infant's cries were never ordinary. They seemed to penetrate barriers, traveling through walls and across fields, reaching ears far beyond the cradle. And with each cry, more misfortune followed, reinforcing the notion that human authority had no power here. Fear and superstition crept even into the hearts of those who had previously scoffed at the enslaved community's spiritual interpretations. Owners began to respect, albeit grudgingly, that this child's presence might be beyond explanation. Some quietly allowed rituals and protective charms to remain in place, reasoning that perhaps appeasement, rather than control, was safer. Others grew increasingly paranoid, sleeping lightly at night, restricting movement on the plantation, and keeping constant watch over the infant. The attempts to control the child ultimately highlighted a terrifying truth. The infant was not merely a newborn to be disciplined or managed. It had become a force in its own right, one that could not be tamed by power, money, or authority. Every scream, every cry, every gaze carried an invisible weight, reminding the plantation owners that some forces were far greater than human will, and that their dominance over the land and its people did not extend to the mysteries of life itself. As the days passed, it became clear that the infant's influence extended far beyond mere cries or occasional misfortune. The very presence of the child seemed to affect the behavior of everyone on the plantation, creating an atmosphere of unease that permeated daily life. Workers, both enslaved and free, reported feeling watched even when no one was near, a sensation that grew more intense whenever the infant was awake or vocalizing. Many described a subtle but undeniable shift in their own movements. Tasks that once took only minutes now seemed to drag on. Hands trembled when performing routine chores, and eyes constantly darted toward the cabin where the infant slept. Some claimed they could hear the baby's cries in their minds, even when it was quiet, a haunting echo that made concentration nearly impossible. Fear, fatigue, and anxiety became constant companions, and the simple act of stepping outside or tending the fields was fraught with a sense of impending doom. There were accounts of sudden arguments or conflicts erupting among workers at odd times, often after the infant had cried. Some believed these incidents were directly influenced by the child, a manifestation of its unseen power over the human psyche. A man who had been calm and dependable would suddenly lash out. A careful worker would make mistakes that endangered crops or animals. The child's presence seemed to heighten emotions, expose hidden tensions, and magnify fear in ways that defied reason. Even those who were skeptical could not escape its effect. Plantation owners noted that employees, no matter how disciplined, would hesitate or falter in their duties. Animals became skittish, machinery seemed to malfunction, and small accidents happened with alarming frequency. The entire plantation operated under a cloud of tension, as though the infant's gaze alone was enough to command behavior, bending people to a rhythm they could neither see nor resist. In essence, the infant's presence reshaped the social and psychological environment of the plantation. Fear was no longer just a response to potential punishment or superstition. It had become a tangible force, influencing decisions, actions, and interactions. Every cry, glance, or gesture from the child seemed to echo through the minds and bodies of those nearby, a reminder that this was no ordinary newborn. The infant was an agent of chaos and fascination, an enigmatic force whose power over the living extended beyond the physical into the realm of the mind itself. The story of the enigmatic infant did not stay confined to the plantation where it was born. As the cries, misfortunes, and strange events persisted, whispers began to travel along the dirt roads, through the quarters, and across the sweltering fields of Alabama. Workers and neighbors alike carried tales of the infant from one plantation to the next, each retelling adding layers of fear, speculation, and fascination. By the time the stories reached neighboring plantations, the child had taken on almost mythical proportions. Some spoke of it as a cursed being, others as a child blessed or burdened by the spirits of the ancestors. The details varied. In some accounts, the infant's cry could shatter a window or make animals flee. In others, it was said that merely hearing the cry from a distance could bring sudden illness or misfortune. Each retelling carried a kernel of truth, but fear and superstition allowed the legend to grow far beyond what anyone had personally witnessed. The enslaved people shared these stories quietly, often around evening fires or in whispered conversations when overseers were absent. They spoke of the infant with a mixture of awe and caution, debating whether it was a warning from the spirits, a punishment for human wrongdoing, or a rare child born with powers beyond comprehension. These conversations were not just idle gossip, they were a way for the community to process fear and to prepare for danger in a world where the unexplained could have very real consequences. Rumors reached even the plantation owners, and with them came a mixture of skepticism and dread. Some dismissed the stories as exaggerations, products of imagination and fear. Yet the consistency of accounts, the inexplicable deaths, and the visible anxiety of the enslaved people forced many to take the tales seriously. Owners began to adopt protective measures, both practical and superstitious, in an effort to safeguard themselves and maintain control over their land. Across Alabama, the infant became a whispered legend. The child whose cries summoned death, a story that was told and retold to warn, to intrigue, and to frighten. It was a rare case where folklore grew directly from a real-life phenomenon, blending the lines between fact and fear. By the time news of the infant reached distant plantations, it was no longer merely a child. It had become a symbol of the unknown, a living embodiment of the tension between life, death, and forces beyond human understanding. In this way, the infant's legend transcended its immediate surroundings, spreading fear and fascination across the region. Every retelling, every whispered rumor, ensured that the story would live on, not only in memory, but as part of the folklore of Alabama, haunting the imagination of all who heard it. Even after the infant's death, the legend refused to die. Many expected that once the child was gone, the cries, the misfortunes, and the palpable fear would fade, but this was not the case. The plantation, and even surrounding areas, remained steeped in unease, as if the infant's presence had left a permanent mark on the land itself. Immediately following the death, strange occurrences continued. Neighbors reported hearing faint, high-pitched cries on still nights, though no child was present. Animals, too, behaved unusually, avoiding certain areas of the plantation or refusing to graze where the infant had once been. Workers experienced sudden chills, unexplained fatigue, and nightmares that mirrored the tragedies that had occurred when the infant was alive. The sense of dread persisted, like a shadow that refused to lift. Among the enslaved people, discussions turned to spirits and unfinished business. Many believed that the infant had not truly departed, that its soul remained tied to the physical world, carrying a message, or perhaps a warning, that had yet to be fully understood. Elders cautioned the young to tread carefully in the rooms or fields the child had occupied, and rituals of protection continued long after the cradle was empty. In their view, the infant had transcended life and become something else entirely, a symbol, a spirit, and a force that could no longer be contained by mortal rules. Even plantation owners, though reluctant to admit it, felt the lingering effect. Machinery broke inexplicably, livestock fell ill without cause, and misfortunes continued in patterns reminiscent of the infant's life. For them, the child's death did not resolve the problem. It only underscored the limitations of human power, reason, and authority. The infant had revealed that some forces exist beyond comprehension, and the plantation would never return to the same sense of normalcy. Stories of the infant's posthumous influence spread far beyond the original plantation, becoming part of Alabama's folklore. Travelers and neighboring workers carried tales of hearing phantom cries or feeling sudden chills in places once inhabited by the child. The legend became a cautionary tale, a reminder of mortality, fear, and the inexplicable powers that might linger long after a life has ended. In this way, the infant achieved a strange form of immortality. Its life was brief, but its presence and the fear it inspired endured far beyond the cradle, the cabins, and the fields. The story became a haunting testament to the unknown, a chilling reminder that some mysteries do not die with the body, and that some cries echo forever in the world of the living. The tale of the enigmatic infant is more than a chilling story. It is a window into the psyche and social dynamics of 1861 Alabama. At a time when slavery dominated life, fear permeated every layer of society, and superstition and science were constantly in tension, this story exemplifies the collision of the known and the unknown. For the enslaved people, the infant's cries were interpreted through the lens of spiritual belief, ancestral wisdom, and a profound understanding of unseen forces. Their fear was not merely born from ignorance, it was rooted in lived experience. The enslaved had witnessed inexplicable deaths, accidents, and natural phenomena that seemed to defy human control. For them, the infant was a messenger, a warning, and a reminder of the world's mysteries beyond human manipulation. Their interpretations demonstrate how communities under extreme oppression often turned to folklore and spiritual understanding to make sense of events that science could not explain. For plantation owners, the story highlights the limitations of reason, authority, and early scientific thought. These men and women, accustomed to controlling people and land through logic, law, and force, found themselves powerless in the face of the infant's inexplicable presence. Their repeated attempts to rationalize, control, or silence the child underscore the tension between human certainty and the vast unknown. The infant became a symbol of what could not be conquered, measured, or tamed, revealing that some aspects of life and death transcend human comprehension. The scientific failures of the time are particularly telling. Despite calling physicians and scholars, employing early instruments of observation, and testing every theory available, nothing could explain the infant's cries or the chain of misfortune that followed. This gap between observed phenomena and rational explanation speaks to the era's broader struggle, a world in transition, where Enlightenment ideals of logic and evidence coexisted uneasily with deep-seated superstition, fear, and belief in the supernatural. Finally, the story's persistence in folklore highlights its cultural impact. Across Alabama, tales of the infant were told and retold, blending history, fear, and myth. It became not just a story of one child, but a reflection of the society itself, its anxieties, its limits of knowledge, and the ways people coped with uncertainty and mortality. The infant embodies the intersection of life and death, science and superstition, control and helplessness, a reminder that some mysteries leave a mark far deeper than time itself. In essence, the enigmatic infant is a historical lens. Through this story, we glimpse a society grappling with power, fear, and the unknown, and we are reminded that even in a world governed by laws, economics, and science, some forces remain stubbornly, terrifyingly beyond human understanding.